Hello and welcome back to Restaurant Planet Podcast with me, your host, Jack Cole. So today I'm joined by Dr. Harmony Patricio from Shoal, who's going to tell us a lot about freshwater. So, Dr. Patricio, welcome. And I'd like to start by telling us a little bit about your background, and then we'll go from there.
Well, thank you, Jack. It's great to be on the podcast. I appreciate you inviting me. A little bit about my background. My main driver for engaging in conservation work is when I was young, I spent a lot of time in rivers and lakes, just, enjoying the water, enjoying nature. I grew up in a very remote part of Colorado in the US, up in the mountains, and had the, benefit of being close to nature. And then when I was doing my bachelor's degree, I took a general ecology course that just blew my mind, learning about all the intricate connections between the environment and organisms that have to happen for basic functioning of the Earth's systems and for human well-being. And then I started learning about how much threat species and ecosystems are facing, and I started getting really concerned about human-caused extinctions. And I have sort of a moral, ethical feeling that is just, there's just something wrong about that. And I wanted to do everything I could to avert human-caused extinctions. And then I learned that freshwater species are facing the highest rates of extinctions, much higher than marine or terrestrial species. So that's how I ended up focusing my work on freshwater species.
Great, and that leads us on nicely to my next question, which is tell us about well, it's not quite a question, it's a statement. Please tell us about the current state of global freshwaters. Where are we, and how are we doing? What's the state of things?
Well, unfortunately, we're facing a bit of a freshwater biodiversity crisis right now. It's very interesting to note freshwaters only cover about 1% of the Earth's surface, while oceans cover about 70%, but about half of all described fish species are found in freshwater. So you have this really rich concentration of biodiversity in such a small area of the Earth. Freshwaters are so essential for human well-being, and the decline of these systems can cause so many effects, not just for the species, but for society, economies as well. Even though they're some of the most biologically diverse systems on Earth, with over, I think there's about 126,000 freshwater dependent species of animals and plants that have been described. So that doesn't include insects and mollusks, and that, well, it does include mollusks, but not just animals and plants, about 126,000. But unfortunately, as I mentioned, they're disappearing much faster than marine or terrestrial species, and about 81 freshwater fishes have been lost to extinction just in modern times. In the North America alone, about 53 species of freshwater fish have gone extinct since the beginning of the 20th century, which is a rate of extinction that's about 870 times higher than the natural rate for freshwater fish. And there's been a decline of freshwater fish populations of about 84% since 1970. And about 1/3 of freshwater fish are currently threatened with extinction. So really nowhere else on Earth is the world's biodiversity crisis more acute than in freshwaters. So this really is a time for people to be educated, to engage, and for urgent action for freshwater species and systems.
And if nothing is done, what would happen to global ecosystems?
Well, there is some, there's some doom and gloom around that question, which, I don't want to paralyze people with these scenarios, but the main threats to freshwater species basically stem from damming and habitat fragmentation, overfishing, water abstraction for many reasons, which has actually tripled globally in the past 50 years. Of course, habitat loss and degradation, pollution, invasive species, and then climate change, which we know is affecting many systems on the planet. And all of us in the freshwater conservation world have a very clear sense that unless urgent action is taken to reduce the threats I just mentioned, we will probably see the extinction of many freshwater species over the coming years. But as I mentioned, there is hope. There are solutions out there. There's been a lot of work done to design kind of an emergency recovery plan for freshwater biodiversity. So there is hope out there despite the kind of worrisome situation we're facing right now.
Right, and of course that then brings us on very nicely to your organization, Shoal, and the work you're doing to prevent all these terrifying apocalyptic outcomes. So tell us about the work that Shoal is doing, how it came together, and a little bit about your core mission.
Well, yeah, let me just explain a little bit what Shoal is and kind of what our goals are. It's basically an initiative where we bring together a wide variety of sectors and partners to tackle this immense challenge of the freshwater biodiversity crisis at the kind of scale that is needed because of these immense threats. Despite the knowledge amongst experts that freshwater systems are declining and the species are disappearing at very high rates, there's been relatively little attention, action, and funding dedicated to conserving these systems and the rich biodiversity they host compared to marine or terrestrial systems. So Shoal was kind of created to fill this gap, and our mission is to halt the extinctions and recover populations of the most threatened freshwater species in the wild. We work with a partnership model and have an intentionally small group of full-time staff. Instead, we channel technical support, provide capacity building, and funding to the most impactful conservation projects that are led by local organizations that are working on the ground all over the world. So we don't have our own staff, in country offices around the world. We partner with communities and local organizations and help them get access to the tools and funding they need to implement the work. And we believe that's kind of the most effective and sustainable way to address these challenges. We're very lucky to be hosted by two influential conservation organizations. One of them is Synchronicity Earth, which is based in the UK. The other is Rewild, which is based in the US. They support us with expertise and some funding and giving us the ability to kind of focus in on the nitty-gritty of fundraising to support local implementing partners, communications, and developing a suite of projects to conserve freshwater species. We also have a big focus on inspiring funders, policymakers, communities, and just the broader public about the wonders found in freshwaters. I think most people aren't aware of how incredible these systems are, how many beautiful species they host. You know, you don't often see what's happening underneath the surface of rivers and lakes. It's not as easy to get the imagery that you might from a tropical coral reef with all the, you know, colorful species. But we want to tell these stories about what's happening in these systems and how unique they are. And we think, you know, without telling these stories and spreading the word, people won't care about these systems and species. And so we need to really expand the communications efforts around this issue. And for this reason, we've developed something called the Freshwater Inspire Network, which is a group of very talented filmmakers, creatives, communicators, and campaigners that are all working together to elevate the awareness about the uniqueness and beauty of freshwater species and systems.
Fantastic. That's a wonderful overview. So going a little bit deeper there, a little bit more specific, could you tell us a bit more about some of the specific projects you've got going on, perhaps with specific species in specific geographical regions?
Absolutely, yeah. Right now we're focusing on our effort on locations with kind of the highest concentrations of threatened freshwater species, get the most bang for our buck through conservation interventions on the ground. One example is in Mexico. We're working with several partners to develop a national strategy for freshwater biodiversity conservation, and specifically another action plan for a highly threatened group of fish called gudeids, which some of them have gone extinct in the wild, so they only exist in aquariums and, you know, conservation breeding facilities. And we're working with local partners to help reintroduce some of these species back to the wild. We have some work going on the Rift Valley Lakes region of Africa. And one of the project examples there is some work in Lake Tanganyika, where we're helping a local partner establish a new freshwater protected area around an island in the lake. We've been really active in Southeast Asia, where we're supporting local partners to protect some very highly threatened peat swamp fishes. So these are species that are maybe familiar to some people, like because they're related to the Siamese fighting fish, the betta fishes that are very popular for home aquariums, and really beautiful, colorful fish, but their habitats are under immense threat and are disappearing very quickly, primarily because of the expansion of palm oil plantations. And then some really cool work is going on in the Sulawesi's ancient lakes, where they have all these amazing, rare, endemic, and very evolutionarily distinct species. In India, we have some work going on with local partners for the conservation of a fish called the humpbacked mahseer, which is a very large fish that was once kind of a prized target for anglers, but it's now confined to just 2 tributaries of the Kaveri River. We're also in India working on a species called the denison's barb, working to protect its habitat. This is another species that's really popular for home aquariums and was once collected from the wild at unsustainable levels, which was the primary driver of its decline. And then one kind of fun, interesting effort I'd like to mention is the search for lost fishes. which is associated with Rewild's Search for Lost Species initiative. And lost species are those that have not been seen by scientists for at least 10 years or more, and their status is uncertain, i.e. we don't know if they've gone extinct in the wild or not. And one example of this work was a project in Turkey where we supported local researchers to search for the Batman river loach, and they were actually successful in finding this fish, which we think is a really good example of a kind of conservation bright spot that can inspire hope for the rediscovery of other species, you know, where their persistence in the wild is uncertain.
Lovely. Okay. Wow, so much going on. Really impressive. So moving on a little bit, so you obviously discussed in a lot of detail there, all over the place, where you've got work going on. What might be some of the solutions that these communities or these groups might be implementing to clean up their riverways, to have better practice, better policies, better governance? What are some of those solutions?
Yeah, so, you know, I do want to say, despite the kind of alarming declines of freshwater biodiversity that I mentioned earlier, there are many reasons to be hopeful, and a lot of work has been done to define what the most effective solutions are. They just need to be implemented, but some experts from around the world have developed what they've called an emergency recovery plan for freshwater biodiversity. And some of the most impactful solutions that we all agree need to be taken are, for example, ensuring rivers are allowed to flow more naturally. That's a big issue in many parts of the world, is the alteration of the flow regimes of rivers. Of course, actions to improve water quality. Essential habitats need to be restored and protected. Overfishing is a challenge in many parts of the world, so policies and management strategies need to be put in place to end overfishing. Invasive species are also a big concern, and so there needs to be real proactive efforts to prevent new invasions of non-native species and to control them in places where they've already been introduced. And then rivers that are still free-flowing, that are not yet impacted by things like dams, need to be protected now so that dams aren't put in these rivers down the road. And we strongly feel that kind of old, obsolete dams need to be removed in many locations. There's also some really exciting mounting evidence that freshwater protected areas, which are kind of reserves where critical habitat has been identified and no fishing is allowed in these areas. And often these areas are managed with local communities in a kind of co-management strategy. There's great evidence that these community co-managed freshwater protected areas can have huge benefits for freshwater biodiversity and these ecosystems.
Fantastic. I'm moving on a little bit to some of the work that you've got going on, or at least coming up. Harmony, would you like to tell us about your strategic framework for critical species?
Yeah, so we recently released a pretty hefty document that we worked in collaboration with the World Conservation Union's Asian Species Action Partnership and Mandai Nature. It's a document called A Strategic Framework to Accelerate Urgent Conservation Action for Critically Endangered Freshwater Fish in Southeast Asia. There are 90 species of critically endangered freshwater fish in the region. That's why the document is quite a long read, but we set it up to be somewhat of a guiding document where you don't have to kind of read it from front to back to get the information you need. You can kind of skip and jump through different sections depending on who the reader is and what kind of information they're after. It's somewhat of a roadmap to guide conservation action, as well as research and funding that will make the most impact for these 90 freshwater fish species in Southeast Asia that are, facing, imminent threat of extinction. And in concert with the release of this framework, we've initiated a grants program where we're providing funding to local organizations in Southeast Asia to implement some of the priority actions that we've described in the framework. So just a few days ago, we had the deadline for the grant proposal submission. And so right now I'm reviewing all these wonderful project proposals from small organizations around Southeast Asia, and very inspired by the level of dedication and awareness and desire to take action that they're demonstrating. So that's really hopeful to me to see that there's a lot of engagement in the region and that there's the potential for positive outcomes from this framework.
And on that, finally, Harmony, tell us about where you'd like to see things more broadly in sort of 10 to 15 years. Obviously quite a broad question. We're talking about global freshwaters, but given what you've been talking about there, the communities, the initiatives, all this brilliant work that you've got going on, and a lot of course, awareness raising, where could we be in, I don't know, time frame 15 to 20 years if we really got things together?
Well, one thing that kind of I love about working with freshwater species, especially freshwater fish, is that when given the chance, they can bounce back to health relatively quickly, in comparison to working with animals like elephants or, rhinoceros that take, possibly decades to recover. Some of these species, if you protect their critical habitats, if you, protect their spawning habitats, give them a chance to reproduce and kind of eliminate the pressures from overfishing, their populations can bounce back just within a few years. So, we think with the right policies being put in place on local and national levels and really engaging closely with communities, we can safeguard the futures of many habitats and species. Our hope is that freshwaters can get to the point where they receive the levels of attention and funding that marine and terrestrial habitats and species receive, or potentially even more so, because they've been neglected for so long. We really hope there will be somewhat of a global change of attitude towards freshwaters, and that people, policymakers, and communities and conservation funders will see freshwater species to be just as remarkable, complex, beautiful, and worth saving as the more familiar marine and terrestrial species. We're currently about to release our 2032 strategy, which outlines what we plan to achieve over the coming decade. And one of our primary goals is to mobilize conservation action for at least 1,000 of the world's most threatened freshwater fish through locally led partnerships. We want to increase the number of our implementation partners so that Shoal has the capacity to catalyze high levels of action around the world, deepen the strength of the Freshwater Inspire network that I mentioned earlier, to increase awareness of the wonders of freshwater biodiversity and the challenges that it's facing, and to raise funds that will be directed to local implementation partners and to priority research that has been identified by our partners from the Freshwater Fish Specialist Group and the Freshwater Conservation Committee that are part of the World Conservation Union Species Survival Commission. So these are kind of the world's foremost experts that are working with us to help guide that aspect of the work. You know, there really is a lot of potential to save these species and habitats if action and funding is scaled up to the level that's needed. And as I said, you know, a lot of these species can recover quite quickly when the conditions are put in place for them to do so. So, you know, I don't want to paralyze people with these alarming statistics that I rattled off in the beginning of the interview. You know, I think it's important that we all are aware of the current bit of a dire situation, but it's also key to understand that a lot of solutions have been identified, and we know that we can be successful if those solutions are implemented.
Wonderful. Dr. Patricio, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Jack.